I'm pregnant with your husband's child, she said softly, as if she were commenting on the weather, and for a moment I thought I had misheard her, the way you sometimes do when a sentence doesn't belong in the room you're standing in. The way your mind tries to protect you from something it refuses to recognize. But the clink of silverware around the table didn't stop, the low hum of the air conditioner carried on, and I realized it wasn't the world that had shifted, it was me. Something inside me going very still, very quiet, like a lake just before the first crack of ice, and I remember my hand hovering over my plate, fingers wrapped around my fork, not moving, not reacting, because reacting would have meant acknowledging what she had just said. And I wasn't ready to give her that, not yet, not in front of everyone, not in front of him, and especially not in front of my son, who was sitting 2 seats away, laughing at something that had been said moments earlier, unaware that the ground beneath his life had already begun to give way, and I turned my head just slightly, enough to see her from the corner of my eye, Emily, my daughter-in-law, her posture relaxed, her expression almost calm, as if she had rehearsed this moment and found it satisfying. As if this was not a confession but a quiet declaration of something she believed she had already won. And then I looked at Richard, my husband of 43 years, and he didn't look at me. He didn't even try, his gaze fixed somewhere on the table, on the neatly folded napkin he had yet to touch, and in that silence, that small, fragile silence stretching across the table, everything I had built my life around began to rearrange itself into something unrecognizable, something colder. And I felt no immediate rush of anger, no sharp sting of betrayal the way people describe in stories. Instead there was only a slow, deliberate awareness, like watching a puzzle piece slide into place after years of not knowing where it belonged, because suddenly the late evenings made sense, the quiet phone calls that ended when I entered the room, the way Emily lingered after everyone else had gone home, offering to help with dishes she never actually finished, the way Richard had begun to compliment her cooking, her opinions, her presence, in ways that felt harmless at the time, in ways I chose to interpret as kindness, because it was easier to believe in kindness than to question the structure of your own home. And I realized then that this moment, this sentence whispered across a dinner table set with my best china, was not the beginning of anything, it was the end of a long series of small decisions, of overlooked glances, of silence where there should have been questions. And I set my fork down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the plate, a small act of control in a moment that threatened to unravel everything, and I took a breath, steady and measured, not because I didn't feel anything, but because I felt too much to let it spill carelessly, because whatever came next would not be decided by her words alone, and as the room continued around me, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the shift that had just occurred, I understood something with a clarity that surprised me. Something that settled into me like a quiet truth I had been avoiding for far too long, that nothing in my life had been taken from me in a single moment, it had been given away slowly, piece by piece, and if there was anything left to reclaim, it would not be done with raised voices or broken plates, it would be done the same way it had been lost, quietly, deliberately, and without asking for permission. Daniel laughed again, louder this time, and I watched him carefully, trying to find some sign that he knew, that he had heard what I had heard, but his face remained open, relaxed, the same boyish expression he had carried since he was a teenager sitting at this very table asking for seconds. And for a brief moment I wondered if ignorance was a kind of mercy, if not knowing could actually protect him from what was already unfolding right in front of him. And Emily reached for her glass, taking a small sip of water as if she had merely added a comment to a passing conversation, her fingers steady, her shoulders loose, and that calmness unsettled me more than anything else, because it told me she had already accepted the consequences, or perhaps she believed there would be none, and I shifted my gaze back to Richard, still not looking at me, his silence no longer neutral but deliberate, like a door quietly closing, and I realized then that whatever existed between them had not been accidental, it had been maintained, protected, allowed to grow in the spaces where I had trusted things to remain unchanged. And I thought about the nights he said he was working late, the weekends he volunteered to run errands alone, the subtle distance that had crept into our conversations, not sharp enough to confront, but persistent enough to settle into the background of our lives. And I remembered how I had dismissed it, how I had told myself that long marriages shift, that people grow quieter, that routine replaces excitement, and I had accepted that explanation because it required nothing from me, because it allowed me to keep everything exactly as it was, and now I could see how convenient that had been for all of us, and I placed my hands flat against the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my palms, grounding myself in something solid, something that had not changed, and I noticed the small details around me with unusual clarity, the flicker of the candle near the center, the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the way the curtains moved slightly with the evening air coming through the open window, and it occurred to me that the world does not pause for personal disasters, it continues in its quiet, indifferent way, and perhaps that is what allows people to carry on, to sit through moments like this without collapsing under their weight. And Emily set her glass down gently, then leaned slightly toward me, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her voice to reach me again, softer this time, almost patient, as if she were waiting for me to respond, to react, to give her the scene she had imagined, and I did not give it to her. I kept my expression neutral, my breathing steady, because something inside me had already shifted from shock to observation, from reaction to understanding, and I could feel the pieces aligning more clearly now. Not just what had happened, but how long it must have been happening, the quiet coordination of schedules, the careful avoidance of suspicion, the way small lies can build a structure strong enough to hold something much larger beneath them. And I thought about the house, the one I had lived in for decades, the one I had believed was filled with shared memories, and I wondered how many of those memories had been unfolding differently for them, how many moments I had experienced as ordinary had carried a second meaning just out of my reach. And Daniel finally looked in my direction, his smile fading slightly as if he sensed something was off, and for a second our eyes met, and I saw confusion there, the beginning of a question he had not yet formed, and I knew that whatever happened next would not only change my life, it would change his, and that knowledge settled heavily but did not shake me, because by then I understood that this was no longer about preserving what we had, it was about facing what it had already become, and I straightened slightly in my chair. Not in defiance, not in anger, but in quiet recognition, because the illusion had ended, and there was no reason left to pretend otherwise. I reached for my glass of water but did not drink from it. I only held it there for a moment, feeling the cool surface against my fingertips, something steady in a room that no longer felt familiar. And I realized that if I spoke too soon, if I allowed the wrong words to come out, I would lose whatever quiet control I still had. And control was the only thing that mattered now, not dignity, not appearances, but control over how this moment would unfold. And I set the glass back down exactly where it had been, aligning it with the edge of the placemat the way I always did, a habit so small no one ever noticed, but it gave me something to hold on to. And Daniel cleared his throat, the sound slightly forced, as if he was trying to pull the room back into something normal, something safe, and he asked Emily a question about work. Something routine, something that belonged to an entirely different evening, and she answered him without hesitation, her voice smooth, her tone even, and I watched that exchange with a growing sense of distance, as though I were no longer sitting at the table but observing it from somewhere just beyond it, and it struck me then that whatever bond one thought existed between us as a family had already fractured long before tonight. Tonight was simply the moment it became visible, and I thought back to the first time I met Emily. How she had stood in my doorway with a polite smile and a carefully chosen dress, how she had called me ma'am instead of Margaret, respectful, almost too respectful, and I had mistaken that for sincerity. I had welcomed her in without hesitation, believing that kindness would be returned with kindness. Because that is how I had built my life, by giving without measuring, by trusting without keeping score, and I could see now how that had made everything easier for her. How it had created a space where she could move freely without being questioned, and I felt no anger toward that version of myself, only a quiet recognition that trust, when given blindly, can become an invitation rather than a gift. And Richard finally shifted in his seat, just slightly, enough for his chair to make a faint sound against the floor, and for a moment I thought he might speak, that he might attempt to explain or deny or at least acknowledge what had been said, but he did none of those things. He reached for his napkin instead, unfolding it slowly, placing it on his lap with unnecessary care, and that small, deliberate action told me more than any words could have. It told me he had already chosen his position in this moment, and it was not beside me, and something inside me settled further, not breaking, not collapsing, but settling, like dust after a long disturbance, and Emily glanced at me again, just for a second, and there was something in her eyes that had not been there before, not guilt, not fear, but expectation, as if she were waiting for me to confirm something she already believed to be true, that I would react, that I would raise my voice, that I would turn this into a scene she could navigate, and I understood then that my reaction was the last piece she needed, the final step in whatever story she had constructed, and I decided not to give it to her, not because I was stronger, but because I had finally begun to see the shape of what was happening, and I knew that anything done in haste would only serve them, not me, and Daniel looked between us again, his confusion deepening, and I felt a brief pull of something softer, something maternal, the instinct to protect him, to shield him from what was coming. But that instinct faded just as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the understanding that he was no longer a child at this table, he was part of this family as it truly was, not as I had imagined it, and he would have to face that truth the same way I was beginning to. And I drew in a slow breath, steady and controlled, and for the first time since the words had been spoken, I allowed myself to fully accept them, not as a shock, not as a question, but as a fact that would now define everything that followed, and in that acceptance, there was a strange kind of clarity, a sense that the path ahead, however difficult, would at least be honest, and honesty, even when it arrives this late, has a way of simplifying things, and I realized that whatever I chose to do next would not be about preserving what we had lost, it would be about deciding what, if anything, was still worth keeping. The room did not change, not in any visible way, the same soft light rested on the table, the same quiet hum filled the background, but everything inside me had shifted into a sharper focus, and as I sat there, watching them continue their small, careful movements, I realized that this moment had not come out of nowhere, it had been building for longer than I had allowed myself to see, and my mind began to move backward, not in panic, but in a slow, deliberate review, like turning pages I had once skipped too quickly, and I remembered a Sunday afternoon nearly a year ago when Emily had stayed behind after dinner, insisting she would help me clean up, though she barely touched a single dish, instead standing near the kitchen doorway, talking to Richard in a tone that felt casual at the time, light, almost playful, and I had noticed how easily he responded, how his voice carried a warmth I had not heard directed at me in years, and I told myself it was harmless, that it was good for them to get along, that a peaceful family was something to be grateful for, and I moved past it without a second thought. And then there were the errands, the small ones that seemed insignificant, the trips to the hardware store, the late evening drives he never used to take, the way he began to offer to pick Emily up when Daniel was busy, explaining it as convenience, as kindness, as something any decent man would do for his family. And I accepted every explanation because it fit into the version of reality I preferred, the version where nothing was wrong, and I realized now how carefully that version had been maintained, not just by them, but by me, because questioning it would have required me to look at something I was not ready to confront. And I thought about the day I found Emily's scarf in the back seat of Richard's car, a soft gray one I had seen her wear before, and when I asked him about it, he answered too quickly, said she must have forgotten it after a ride home, and I nodded, I accepted it, I even smiled, because the alternative felt unnecessary, felt disruptive, felt like something that would only complicate what was otherwise a calm and stable life, and now, sitting at this table, I could see how each of those moments had been a small opening, a quiet invitation for something larger to take root, and I felt no anger toward those memories, only a steady awareness of how easily trust can be shaped into something that works against you, and Daniel's voice broke through my thoughts again. Softer this time, asking if everything was all right. And I looked at him, really looked at him, at the concern beginning to form in his expression, and I understood that he was standing at the edge of something he did not yet understand, and I wondered how long it would take before he saw it clearly, before the pieces arranged themselves for him the way they had for me. And Emily shifted slightly in her chair, her hand resting lightly against the table, her posture still composed, still confident, and I recognized that confidence now for what it was, not innocence, not even defiance, but certainty, the kind that comes from believing you have already secured your place, that whatever consequences exist will fall on someone else. And I turned my attention back to Richard, and this time he did glance at me, just briefly, his eyes meeting mine for less than a second before moving away again, and in that fleeting moment I saw something I had not expected, not guilt, not exactly, but something closer to resignation, as if he had already accepted the outcome of this situation, whatever it might be, and that realization settled into me with a quiet finality, because it meant that whatever remained of our marriage had already been decided without me, long before tonight, and I straightened my shoulders slightly, not as a reaction to them, but as a response to that understanding, because if decisions had been made in my absence, then what I did next would not be about seeking answers, it would be about defining what comes after, and for the first time since the words had been spoken, I felt something steady return to me, not comfort, not even strength, but a sense of direction, a quiet certainty that while I could not undo what had been done, I could still choose how I would move forward, and that choice, however small it seemed, was entirely mine. Daniel's question lingered in the air longer than it should have, stretching the silence into something that could no longer be ignored, and I could feel all of them becoming aware of it at the same time, the way a room shifts when something unspoken begins to demand attention, and I turned my head toward him fully now, meeting his eyes with a calm I did not entirely feel, but had chosen to hold, and I nodded once, a small, measured gesture that answered his question without revealing anything, because there was nothing I could say in that moment that would not change everything for him instantly, and I was not ready to be the one to take that from him, not yet, and Emily watched that exchange carefully, her gaze moving between us, calculating, waiting, and I could see now that her earlier words had not been a mistake, not a slip of the tongue, but a deliberate act, a line drawn quietly but with intention, and the more I considered it, the more I understood that this dinner, this ordinary evening I had prepared with such routine care, had been chosen for a reason, because it gathered all of us in one place, because it made what she said impossible to ignore, impossible to contain, and that realization did not anger me, it clarified things, it revealed the structure beneath the surface, and I found a strange sense of steadiness in that clarity. Because once something is visible, it can no longer hide, and I shifted slightly in my chair, the movement subtle but enough to draw a small breath from Emily, as if she thought I might finally respond in the way she expected, but instead I reached for the serving dish in the center of the table and passed it toward Daniel, asking if he wanted more, my voice even, controlled, almost gentle, and he hesitated before answering, his eyes searching my face for something more. Something that would explain the tension he could feel but not yet understand, and when he finally nodded, I served him carefully, the same way I had done for years, the same way I had always done, and in that simple act I felt the weight of everything that had been taken for granted, everything that had been assumed to remain unchanged, and I realized that this moment, this quiet continuation of routine, was not denial, it was choice, a decision to move forward on my own terms rather than be pulled into theirs. And Richard shifted again, his discomfort becoming more visible now, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table before stopping abruptly, as if he had caught himself, and I could sense the pressure building around him, the expectation that he would speak, that he would take control of the situation, but he remained silent, and that silence spoke more clearly than anything else could have, because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that he was not going to intervene, not going to correct, not going to protect what we had built, and that absence of action was its own decision, one that placed him firmly where he had already been standing, just not openly, and I felt something settle deeper within me, not grief, not shock, but a kind of final acceptance, the recognition that whatever bond had existed between us had already been replaced by something else, something I had not chosen, and Emily leaned back slightly, her posture easing as if she sensed that the moment was not unfolding the way she had anticipated, that the reaction she expected was not coming, and for the first time since she spoke, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her expression, small but unmistakable, and I saw it clearly, that brief shift, and I understood then that control does not always come from speaking louder or acting faster, sometimes it comes from refusing to follow the script someone else has written for you, and I placed my hands back in my lap, folding them together with quiet precision, and I let the silence stretch again, not as an absence, but as something deliberate, something I was allowing to exist until it revealed what needed to be seen, and as the seconds passed, I realized that I was no longer waiting for them to explain anything. I was waiting for the moment when I would decide to speak, and that moment, when it came, would not be driven by emotion, it would be chosen with care, because whatever I said next would not simply respond to what had happened, it would define what happens after, and for the first time that evening, I felt ready for that responsibility. The silence had stretched long enough to become its own presence, something that pressed gently against every person at the table, and I could feel it settling differently on each of us, on Daniel as confusion, on Richard as avoidance, on Emily as a quiet impatience that she was trying to conceal, and I realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment where I would either collapse into reaction or remain exactly as I was, and I could almost sense her weighing those two possibilities, measuring which one would serve her better, and I understood then that whatever she had planned did not account for stillness. It did not account for restraint, and that gave me something I had not expected to find in this situation, an advantage, small but clear, and I lifted my gaze slowly, not abruptly, not with force, but with intention, and I looked directly at her for the first time. Since she had spoken, really looked at her, not as a daughter-in-law, not as part of my family, but as someone who had made a decision that would now shape all of our lives, and she held my gaze, her expression steady at first, but I could see the effort behind it, the slight tightening around her eyes, the careful control of her breathing, and in that moment I understood that confidence, when tested, often reveals what it is made of, and I spoke then, my voice even, measured, not raised, not sharp, just clear enough to belong in the room without disturbing it, and I said her name, Emily, nothing more at first, just that, and the way the conversation stopped entirely told me that everyone had been waiting for something to break the silence, and now that it had, there was no returning to what this evening had been before, and I paused for a moment after saying her name, not to create drama, but to choose my next words carefully, because I knew that once they were spoken, they would carry a weight that could not be taken back, and I asked her a simple question, one that did not accuse, did not judge, but required an answer. I asked her how long she had known, and for the first time since this began, she hesitated. Just slightly, her composure shifting enough to reveal that she had not expected that question, that she had prepared for something else, something louder, something easier to respond to, and that hesitation told me more than any answer could have, because it showed me that her certainty was not as complete as she wanted it to appear, and Daniel turned toward her quickly, his confusion sharpening into concern, and I could see him beginning to understand that this was not a misunderstanding, not a misplaced comment, but something real, something that involved him more than he was ready to accept, and Richard finally spoke then, not to clarify, not to explain, but to interrupt, his voice low, controlled, as if he believed he could still guide the direction of the conversation, but I did not look at him, I did not respond to him, because I had already seen where his silence had placed him, and there was nothing he could say now that would change that position, and Emily answered my question eventually, her voice quieter than before, less certain, and she gave a timeline that confirmed what I had already begun to piece together, not in exact detail, but enough to make it clear that this had not been recent, not impulsive, but something that had been allowed to continue over time, and as she spoke, I felt no surge of emotion, no sudden need to react, only a deepening clarity, a sense that the final pieces were falling into place exactly where they belonged, and when she finished, the room fell silent again, but this time it was different, heavier, more defined, because now the truth was no longer hidden beneath suggestion, it had been spoken, acknowledged, placed directly in front of all of us, and I sat there, absorbing it, not as a shock, but as a confirmation, and I realized that whatever came next would not be about uncovering anything further, it would be about deciding what to do with what had already been revealed, and that decision, I understood now, was entirely mine. Daniel's chair moved back abruptly, the legs scraping lightly against the floor, not loud enough to break anything, but enough to mark a shift that could not be undone, and he looked at Emily as if seeing her for the first time, not as his wife, not as the woman he had built a life with, but as someone standing on the other side of a truth he had not been invited into, and his voice, when it came, was unsteady in a way I had not heard since he was a child trying to make sense of something too big for him. And he asked her to repeat what she had said, not because he had not heard it, but because he needed it to become real in a way that only repetition can make possible, and Emily did not repeat the exact words this time, she softened them, adjusted them, as if trying to reshape the moment into something less sharp, less final, but the meaning remained unchanged, and I watched Daniel absorb it piece by piece, the confusion giving way to something heavier, something that settled into his expression slowly, and I felt a quiet distance form between us, not because I no longer cared, but because I understood that this was now his reality to face, just as it was mine, and Richard shifted again, his discomfort no longer hidden, and he finally spoke with more force than before, not to deny, not to apologize, but to manage, to contain, to bring the situation back under some form of control, and he said that this was not the time, not the place, that things should be discussed privately, later, away from the table, away from the structure of the family evening that had already collapsed, and I recognized that instinct immediately. The desire to move the truth into a quieter space where it could be reshaped, where it could be explained in ways that might soften its impact, and I realized that if I allowed that, if I agreed to that shift, then everything that had been revealed would begin to blur again, to lose its clarity, and I was no longer willing to let that happen, and I spoke before anyone else could respond, my voice still even, still measured, but now carrying a firmness that had not been there before, and I said that there would be no later, no private discussion that pretended this had not already been brought into the open, and the words settled into the room with a quiet weight, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable, and Richard looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing something he had not expected to find, and for a moment I saw uncertainty in his expression, not about what had happened, but about how I would respond to it, and that uncertainty told me that whatever version of me he had relied on in the past, the one who avoided conflict, who preserved peace at all costs, was no longer the one sitting across from him, and Emily remained still, her earlier confidence now replaced by a careful watchfulness, as if she were reassessing the situation in real time, adjusting her expectations, and Daniel stood there beside his chair, not sitting, not moving away, caught between staying and leaving, between asking more questions and avoiding answers altogether, and I felt the weight of that moment, the way it balanced on the edge of something irreversible, and I understood that what I said next would not only define my position, it would define the direction this entire situation would take, and I allowed a brief silence to settle again, not because I needed time, but because I wanted them to feel it, to sit with what had already been said without distraction, without escape, and then I spoke, not to accuse, not to argue, but to establish something simple and clear. I said that the truth had already been spoken at this table, and that it would remain here, in this room, exactly as it was, without being softened, without being moved, without being hidden again, and as the words left me, I felt a quiet shift, not in them, but in myself, a movement from reacting to defining, from absorbing to deciding, and I realized that whatever control I had thought I lost had never truly been taken, it had only been waiting for me to recognize it, and now that I had, there was no reason to give it away again. No one moved for a moment after I spoke, as if the room itself had to adjust to the fact that there would be no retreat from what had already been placed on the table, and I could see it settling over them in different ways. Daniel standing still with his hands at his sides, his breathing shallow, his eyes moving between Emily and Richard as if searching for something that could still make sense of this, something that could restore the version of his life he had walked into this evening believing was real, and Emily, who no longer leaned back with quiet confidence, now sitting more upright, her shoulders slightly tense, her gaze no longer steady but shifting in small, careful movements, as though she were trying to find the safest place to land within a situation that was no longer following the path she had expected, and Richard, who had finally stopped trying to manage the moment, his hands now resting flat on the table, his posture rigid in a way that suggested not strength, but the absence of any clear direction, and I watched all of this without interruption, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood that silence, when held long enough, has a way of revealing what words often hide, and in that silence, I could see the truth of each of them more clearly than I ever had before, and it did not feel like a discovery as much as it felt like recognition, as though I had been given the final piece of something I had been looking at for years without fully understanding, and I drew a slow breath, steady and measured, and I allowed myself to feel the weight of that recognition without resisting it, without trying to soften it or explain it away, because there was no value in doing that anymore. And when I finally spoke again, my voice did not rise, it did not sharpen, it remained exactly as it had been, calm, deliberate, and I said that there were things I needed them to understand, not requests, not questions, but statements that would define what came next, and I could see Daniel turn toward me more fully, as if anchoring himself to something familiar, something that might still offer clarity, and I met his gaze briefly before Continuing, and I said that this house, this table, this life we had all shared, had been built on trust, not perfection, not control, but trust, and that once that trust was broken, it did not simply repair itself through explanation or time. It changed the structure of everything around it, and I paused, not to create tension, but to let the words exist fully in the space, to give them the weight they deserved, and I continued by saying that I would not argue, I would not ask for details that no longer mattered, because the truth had already been made clear in the only way that counted, and I saw Emily's expression tighten slightly at that, as if she had expected resistance, negotiation, something she could respond to, and was now faced with something she could not easily navigate, and I turned my attention to Richard then, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a quiet finality, and I told him that whatever choices he had made had already been carried out, and that I would not stand in the space they had created for themselves, and as I said it, I felt something release within me, not pain, not even disappointment, but a kind of clarity that comes when something unresolved finally reaches its conclusion. And Daniel shifted again, his voice breaking slightly as he asked what that meant, and I looked at him carefully, understanding that this was the moment where the direction of everything would become real, not just for me, but for him as well, and I chose my words with care, not to protect him from the truth, but to give it to him in a way that was steady, and I said that it meant things would not continue as they had, that what we had known as a family would not simply return, and that each of us would have to decide what we were willing to carry forward from this point on. And the words settled into him slowly, visibly, and I could see the shift as it happened. The realization that there was no simple resolution waiting at the end of this, no quick explanation that would restore what had been lost, and as that understanding moved through the room, I remained exactly where I was, not retreating, not advancing, simply holding the space I had chosen, because for the first time that evening, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me, I was defining what would happen next, and that difference, though quiet, changed everything. The room felt smaller after that, not because anything had physically changed, but because the space between us had been filled with something that could not be ignored or undone, and I could see it in the way Daniel remained standing, as if sitting down again would mean accepting a version of reality he was not ready to accept, and I could see it in the way Emily's hands, once steady, now rested too still against the table, as if any movement might expose the uncertainty she was trying to contain, and I could see it in Richard, who no longer attempted to guide the moment, his earlier instinct to control replaced by a quiet stillness that suggested he understood there was no longer anything he could shape or soften, and I allowed myself to take in that entire picture without rushing past it, because this was the truth of what had been built, not the version I had believed in, but the one that had existed beneath it, and I realized that there was no need for anything dramatic, no raised voices, no final declarations, because everything that mattered had already been revealed in the simplest way possible, and I reached for my napkin then, folding it carefully, the same way I had done at the end of countless meals, a small, familiar gesture that carried a different meaning now, and I placed it beside my plate with quiet precision, and as I did, I felt a sense of completion settle over me, not closure in the way people often describe it, but a clear understanding that this moment marked an ending, whether anyone else was ready to acknowledge it or not. And Daniel finally spoke again, his voice lower now, steadier but still uncertain, asking what would happen next, and I looked at him with a calm that came not from ease, but from clarity, and I told him that what happened next would depend on the choices each of us made moving forward, not on what had already been done, because that could not be changed, and I saw him try to process that, to find something solid within it, something that could guide him, and I knew that he would not find it immediately, that this would take time, and that time would not be kind in the way it reshaped his understanding of everything he thought he knew, and I turned my attention to Emily one last time, and I did not accuse her, I did not question her, I simply held her gaze long enough for her to understand that I saw her clearly now, not through the lens of family or expectation, but as she truly was in this moment, and there was nothing left to interpret or assume, and then I looked at Richard, and for a brief second there was a memory there, not of what had just happened, but of everything that had come before, years of shared routines, quiet mornings, ordinary evenings that had once felt enough, and I let that memory pass without holding on to it, because it belonged to something that no longer existed, and I stood up slowly from the table, not abruptly, not in anger, but with the same deliberate calm that had carried me through the entire evening, and the sound of the chair moving back was soft, almost unnoticeable, but it marked a shift that could not be reversed, and I gathered nothing else, not my glass, not my plate, because there was nothing I needed to take from this moment, and as I stepped away from the table, I felt no hesitation, no pull to stay and resolve what could not be resolved in words, only a quiet certainty that leaving was not an escape, it was a decision, and as I walked toward the doorway, I did not look back, not because I was avoiding them, but because there was nothing left behind me that required another glance, and I understood then, with a clarity that felt both heavy and steady, that the life I had been living had already ended before this evening began, and what remained now was not something to repair, but something to redefine, and for the first time since the words had been spoken, I felt something close to peace, not because the situation had been resolved, but because I no longer needed it to be anything other than what it was, and that understanding, quiet and firm, was enough to carry me forward.